The ordinary means of grace are exactly as they're called. They're the ordinary means by which God delivers his grace to us. So if we're refusing to receive God's grace, it means we're refusing to receive God's grace. And the only people ultimately who are not forgiven are those who refuse to receive God's grace. This passage has more to do with us on the individual level, us being actively engaged and partaking in the administration of the covenant of grace, the visible means of grace. If we refuse to be baptized, if we refuse to partake of the Lord's Supper, if we refuse to attend church and to sit under the preaching of the word and to pray, then we are turning down God's offer of grace, taking the gift that he desires to give us, and we're saying no thank you.
Hey, brother, do you still believe in one another?
Welcome to episode 501 of the Reformed Brotherhood. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Tony, and this is the podcast with ears to hear. Hey, brother.
Hey, brother. Well, we've got some more kingdom teaching on tap right from the mouth of Jesus. We're going through all the parables if you haven't been tracking with us so far, and we're finding ourselves in Mark chapter 13. And as only Jesus can do, packs 4 verses with all kinds of rich, robust theology. And it's all in this kind of strange setting, actually. A guy heads out of town. He hands his servants the keys. He tells the doorman, hey, watch the place, with the same kind of an enigmatic and vague energy that I imagine like your cable internet provider gives you when they give you an arrival time between now and Friday. And then Jesus lists like every possible hour he might show up: evening, midnight, rooster clock, dawn. And all of this is for his glory and for our benefits. And we're going to somehow try to see if we can take all of these 4 verses, which are so jam-packed, and fit them into our conversation. That's our challenge, and it's going to be yours to listen to. So welcome to this episode. But before we do all of that, it is everybody's favorite time. Well, except for Wicked of the Scriptures. That is really everybody's favorite time. Second favorite time is where we find something in our lives, Tony, that we either affirm with because it's awesome, it's exciting, we want everybody to know about it, or conversely, we deny against something because it's just not that great. We don't like it. Don't waste your time with it. So everybody longs to know in this conversation, are you affirming with or denying against?
I'm affirming something tonight. The listener might remember, I don't know, maybe a month and a half back, I affirmed a particular setting of Psalm 63 in the Trinity Psalter hymnal. And as I was kind of, looking around I wanted to find a track to sort of maybe add to the end of the episode, just to sort of like put a point on that. I stumbled on a song singer. I don't know if we call him a songwriter because he's mostly just writing psalms, but he's arranging them. He's writing the guitar line for it or whatever. His name is Matthew David Montgomery. I don't know that you would know him from anywhere, but he's on Apple Music, YouTube, Spotify, wherever. He does an arrangement of "Oh God, Show Mercy to Us," which is Psalm 63, setting A, I believe, in the Trinity Psalter hymnal. But it's in other hymnals, other psalters under the same name with the same tune. He has a beautiful singing voice. He does a lot of what's typically called like finger style guitar picking, which is just very melodious and very gentle and soft. It would be a great addition to like your morning devotional time to just like pick a psalm that he sings that he's recorded. You can get most of his stuff for free on YouTube, or again, if you have Apple Music or Spotify, it's available there. Again, his name is Matthew David Montgomery, and he's got several albums. He has ones that specifically is psalms called Psalms for Singing. And then he has a couple fingerstyle hymn songs, hymn albums that are like, like, I don't know, more modern hymns. He Will Hold Me Fast, Only Holy God,
Right.
kind of like Getty style and City Light songs, those kinds of sort of that complex of modern hymnody. But he's excellent, and it's excellent, theologically rich sound music. I haven't listened to everything, but he seems like he's in kind of that sort of vein of worship music producer peoples that are just putting out good, accessible music. I know like a lot of small churches have in the past have had to resort to using tracks like this actually to sort of lead their vocal music. That would be something to think about. It's simple. It's arranged in a straightforward fashion. Many times it's arranged according to the psalters, which are almost by definition are designed for congregational singing. So it's good. It's great. Use it for family worship, listen to it in your car. I don't know, workout music. I don't know if you would work out to this, but I guess you could try. But
I
yeah,
love it.
I usually listen to Oh God, Show Mercy to Us probably like once a day. I listen to it usually in the morning to kind of center my day and get my head in the right space. But yeah, it's just good stuff. Matthew David Montgomery. The specific one was Psalms for Singing, but all of his stuff is really great.
All right, people are going to think we're totally conspiring now, but I promise we're not. This is just how our minds work in collective fashion, that we never speak about stuff together. So my affirmation is right in the same vein. So I'm actually excited about this one because it might just be the golden age of daily books about like theological meditation. It might be. And so this one is really good. And I'm super stoked because I'm kind of on the cusp of this one because I got an advanced copy of this book and it's just out now. It's called Awake My Soul, and it's daily readings, 365 hymn texts taken throughout church history from the Middle Ages to 1900. And each hymn for the day includes a suggested tune and then like a short historical / like theological meditation. The beauty of
Wow.
this is, one, I'm learning all kinds of new hymns. They're not my favorite. Two, you can either read them or there's no music included in this, except that in the back, there's an index that will give you, there's like a little code every day. This is like, it's your own treasure hunt. There's a little code on each day. And if you take that code and go back to the end of the book, what you'll find there is names of popular hymns or songs that you do know the tune to. And then you can take that same tune and use the same poetic meter that the hymn is in that you don't know. And guess what? You can actually sing it. So you're prepared every day to sing music and to sing brand new music with great confidence and high conviction. So this is like the bridge here. Go listen to some good music. And I would say if you want to buy this, because it is brand new, go to hymnworks.com. It's by P&R Publishing. That's where you'll find the best price. It's like $25. It's a beautiful cloth bound, like handsome 2-color printing with a ribbon. And also Passion Week and Advent are clearly marked and can be adapted for use in any calendar year. So there you go. Like it's the double-barreled affirmation for good singing, good hymns. By the way, for all the brothers and sisters of exclusive psalmody, we see you raising your hands in the back. Actually, if you're doing exclusive psalmody, you're in the front. So we see you in the front. And
you're probably not raising your hands.
You're raising your hand. We see your hands in your pockets.
Stoically.
Yeah, we see your hands in your pockets, never coming out. That's fun.
Yeah.
This book also is for you because so much of it is actually just the Psalms adapted for kind of more, when I say contemporary, between the Middle Ages and 1900 worship. So there you go. I think this is lovely. We didn't plan it, but you've got 2 great resources for daily living and daily singing.
Yeah. And, I think there is sort of an element, and I'll be quick about this, where we are set up, we have such a dearth of riches in terms of accessibility to musical worship. And, used to think of it as like daily devotions, but I think the more accurate and I think a more theologically rich term is a daily liturgy.
Right.
With books like Be Thou My Vision, by I think it's David Gibson, or, he has like the Christmas version and I think there's an Easter version of it where it really walks you through a full daily liturgy with like a call to worship and a confession of sin. And you could take these resources, whether it's an album like David or like David Michael Montgomery, that's a country singer, I think, whatever the guy is that I recommend. I don't even have his name in front of me. Whether it's an album like that, or whether it's this resource Jesse's talking about, or like I've said before, like just the Trinity Psalter hymnal app on your phone, which will play the music for you and display the words. You can take this and I hate to say it this way because I know there's a lot of people that make good, profitable use of sort of like evangelical, I would call it like fluffy Devo kind of stuff, which ironically on my list of affirmations of things that are in the queue, there's a devotional resource that even kind of falls in this category.
Yeah,
but there really is no good excuse for not having some sort of robust daily worship pattern, because you can really make use of these resources to create a pretty cohesive, well put together, pleasurable kind of daily worship set or liturgy or experience. I don't know, whatever word you want to slot in there. and really get like really just have an excellent experience out of it, really have good resources. So yeah, I'm on board. I think it's great. I would love to be able to take a look at that. So maybe next time we're in the same geographical location, you have to show me.
Oh, I'll bring it. We'll do it. It actually doubles as a hymnal because it's all indexed, so you can actually
Yeah.
just use it as a hymnal. I love books that give you two purposes. Oh, that's a double threat book right there. And that means like for the spaces taken up in your life and on your shelf, it can do more than one thing. That's like having a kitchen appliance that like, I don't know, is like an air fryer and it brews beer. Like that's
Yeah.
worth the space all the time.
Yeah, I just recently found out that they make washers that are also dryers and they're in the same machine, and
Wow. That's
I would
Transformers
feel
time.
like a millionaire if I had one of those.
Well,
Cause
speaking of feeling like a millionaire, and I think what you challenge us with is settling in some patterns of daily worship and living for God. It just so happens that Jesus has some instruction for us in that same way in Mark
nice.
chapter 13. So let me start beginning in verse 32. And if you're tracking along or keeping score at home and you've gone to this chapter, what you're probably going to find is we're actually in the parable of the fig tree, or just at the end. Oh, but we're not going to touch that one. Not yet. So don't get too excited. We're actually coming right at the end of that. So picking up in verse 32. But of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Now, this is Jesus speaking. See to it, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It's like a man away on a journey who, leaving his house and giving authority to his slaves, each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good parable. And this is covering a lot of the same ground as other parables that we've approached. I think what's a little bit unique or different about this one is that some of the cautions that we brought out with the other parables, because they were actually longer and had more details, some of those cautions don't necessarily apply the same way here.
Right.
Right. We talked about the parable of the ten virgins, or the wise and foolish virgins, whatever you want to call it. And we talked a lot about how this language of like stay awake seemed to be misapplied as like falling asleep is foolish, because in that particular parable, both the wise and the foolish virgins fall asleep. It's not the falling asleep that was the problem, it was the being prepared for the master's return. In that case, having the proper equipment, having your lamps trimmed, your oil ready, all that stuff. In this parable, it really is about being awake. Like, being awake is the task, it's the
Yes,
specific
that's
command.
right.
And so our task tonight is to unpack a little bit about what it even means to be awake. What does this parable say to us about that? But I think this one falls a little bit more in line with kind of what we maybe, and I know this is weird to say, it falls a little bit more in line with what we've been talking about as a sort of like a little bit of a legalistic approach to some of the parables. This one really does have, I think, has more to do with the sort of production that Christians are expected to have,
Right.
the holiness, the good works we're expected to have, and how that plays into kind of our alertness, our fittedness for service, and maybe ultimately even the way that we're rewarded in the last times, or in heaven. All of that kind of plays in here, and this is kind of like Mark's equivalent to sort of like the eschatological parables that we talked about at the end of Matthew, and Matthew 25, and sort of that area.
I totally agree. I think this bad boy, even just the first verse, it's like a compact statement of the doctrine of vocation and providence all wrapped into one. And it's easy to read it and just kind of fly by that stuff and say, of course, I need to be aware of what's going on. I need to be aware of God's presence or seek him in worship. All that's true. But there's a lot in this because, of course, the master's departure here corresponds clearly to Christ's ascension. There's like a real bodily absence that nonetheless does not amount to like abandonment. And then to your point, what I think starts to differentiate us from some of like the other parables where we've been very careful about parsing this, has been this assignment, each his own work. It's reflecting like really traditional, like Reformed, I think, emphasis, even from like Calvin's doctrine of vocation, that the Christian life between the Ascension and the Parousia is not one of like passive waiting, but there is like an active, differentiated stewardship, and it's every believer. And even though it's just a sentence, there's like a lot of particularity in this to remind us that each one has a task, and that task is something that you should undertake on behalf and for the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, the other element of this that I think is interesting is, we don't want to, we want to be careful not to try to build entire theological like edifices. I'm not sure which word is right. We don't want to build huge theological structures on top of like slight variations in words. And I know that that can sometimes be very popular in our circles, and I absolutely support the grammatical historical interpretive method. I don't think it's the only hermeneutic we should think about, but I definitely agree with the words matter and the meanings of the words matter. Right. But we can also go too far in like making an entire theological point hang on the particular choice of a verb like a verb tense or mood or whatever. But I think it's interesting. The sort of what we might call the parable proper starts in verse 34. But in verse 33, it says, "Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come." That's not the parable. That's Christ giving a command to his immediate audience, and then I think vicariously, therefore, for us. When we get into the parable, and it says that the command for the doorkeeper, right? So he takes his servants, he puts his servants in charge, and I take that to mean like he leaves the house to them, like he leaves them to their task. They're not having to report to anybody. They just manage the household autonomously or independently. Each with his work. So there's this idea that like each of the servant has their own proper sort of realm of the house that they manage, right? The gardener is managing the garden, the house, the person who's in charge of the money is managing that. And the doorkeeper, which is a particular role, his task, his charge, he is commanded to stay awake. Now, the word for stay awake in verse 34 is not the same word that's used in verse 33. Now, I have not done the word study on this or the commentary work to know how significant that is, but we do affirm that the Holy Spirit inspires each individual word.
That's right.
And I think we can make an argument that sometimes a word is just used, at least on a human level. It's just, you don't want to use the same word multiple times. Like just like anyone writing any sort of piece of work, you don't use the same word repetitively. You vary the words, use synonyms to spice it up and to give it some variety. But also, I think there may be some significance in the fact that within the story, within the parable, the command to stay awake is a particular word, and then a different word to stay awake and to be watchful. And there's this repetition, be on guard, keep awake. Like those are parallel statements. That's a significant thing that word is different.
Yeah, it's a huge, I think, reminder that there's all that, even again, I can't believe how much is packed now. I think about this, we start talking about it into like a single sentence. But every believer, like every servant in this house, has been given some kind of task suited to his place. I believe that's what Jesus is trying to impress us with. And that idleness is not an option countenanced by the text, because the doorkeeper's particular charge to watch, like you were saying, functions to me, I think, almost like a synecdoche. Like it's for the whole household's duty. His vigilance stands for what is in fact required of every servant, since verse 37 will then extend this command to like everybody. So just within like this little space of writing or this little space of teaching, I think what we have here is like, it's realistic for us to say, we've got the twin realities that ground really biblical ecclesiology in the interim period. We have Christ's real absence, but that's like against, I would say, any collapsing of the already into a fully realized eschatology. And then you have Christ's ongoing ownership and authority over his house, which is the church, against any notion that the church is left to autonomous self-governance. So the house, in other words, remains Christ's, and the servants remain accountable to him, not to themselves, like you've just said, and each one is accountable to God in a unique way according to the task that he's given them. So again, this beautiful marriage of both the responsibility, the providence, and the responsibility that we have before God in being responsible to him, but also that he is governing all things for his good and for his glory.
Yeah. And, I think the word doorkeeper here too, as I peek at the Greek a little bit, the word doorkeeper is also a much broader term than it might seem. Like I think, one of my kids' favorite shows is like Curious George, and there's a character in the story that's literally named Doorman. And he's just the guy that like opens the door in the apartment that
Right.
Curious George and the man in the yellow hat. But the word doorkeeper in the Greek here, when applied to a female, is understood to be like the janitor. So the doorkeeper might even be considered something more like the master of the house. Like think of
Layman's.
like the head butler, right? In like if you think of like Downton Abbey, right? The
Right.
guy who actually like takes care of and like runs the house manager or something like that might be a better way to look at it. And I think you're right that his charge to stay awake, to keep alert, it does extend to the entire household, but it also is a particular command for that figure,
Right.
right? So yes, everybody is given their task. This person, this doorkeeper, he is called out specifically, individually, right? It's not as though he's the only servant in the house. There's all these other servants, they each have their task, and they're all commanded to keep about their business. The doorkeeper, the master of the house, the I don't know, head butler, the chief janitor, I don't know what you would want, the head custodian of the house. And don't think of custodian or janitor in terms of like the school janitor who like cleans the toilets and mops up after the kids throwing up and stuff. The janitor, the custodian of the house is really the person who kind of like runs the household, the sort of like head servant of the house. His command to keep watchful, to be on guard or to be alert is because the master's return is sudden and unexpected. And so
Right.
if the doorkeeper doesn't keep up with things, if he's not awake, if he's not running things, if he's not managing things, if he's not alert and awake, then not only does his task get undone, and I think like we think of it like, oh yeah, be on guard. You sometimes hear this parable or variations of this parable taught as like you got to keep the wolves out, like he's the guard at the
Right.
door. I don't think that's what this is getting at. It's really more like if the doorkeeper falls asleep on the job, then the entire house falls into disarray, and you can't recover that when the master all of a sudden is at the gate. If you're just the guard, I guess you might be able to snap to attention and like, pull your pole arm or whatever it is up. Like you might be able to snap to attention and kind of fake it. But if you're the guy who manages the entire household and the whole household is in disarray because you've fallen asleep on the job, there's no recovering from that when the master taps you on the shoulder and says, please wake up, I'm home. You just can't recover from that. And so I think that's the element of the story, the element of the parable that we probably need to think about a little bit more is, all right, no one of us is the doorkeeper of the church,
That's right.
but also none of us are not the doorkeeper of the church. So like we all have a role and a responsibility in the church to sort of like be a part of an active part of the church, an active part of God's kingdom, which is not, I'm not trying to say we're all gatekeepers, right? We're not all called to rule over the church. Like there's a particular office of ruling elder that I would say exists, that's codified in the OPC, but even within other kinds of setups, there's usually some sort of elder set up where there's elders that are not teaching elders. They're not there to like teach and minister and preach. They're there to like govern the church and support the needs of the body spiritually. That's really, like a particular office, but that's also a task and a role that we all share as Christians is to sort of, I almost said shepherd, but that doesn't feel right, but it also doesn't feel wrong, to sort of like manage the business of the congregation and the
That's
church
right.
and the invisible church as a whole. That's the task of every Christian, and that's really what this parable is getting at, I think.
I think so too. And I don't want to like build too far a bridge away from that point. I think it's worth sitting there for a second because what occurs to me as you were saying that is I just happened to be reading Calvin's commentary this morning in 1 Corinthians 5, and he builds this whole theological argument around this idea that he basically saying, why should the Corinthians mourn over one man's sin? And he gives two reasons. First, as a consequence of the communion that exists among the members of the church, it's becoming that all should feel hurt at or so deadly if one of their members should fall. And the second is when such an erroneous sin is perpetrated in a particular church, the perpetrator is an offender in such a manner that he pollutes the whole society. That is to say, I think it's kind of in line with what you're saying, that corruption in one place will affect the entire body. That is like falling asleep, pulling away from the mission, being found outside of the mission of God's for God's glory is something that hurts the church body. And we might ask, like, if there is in our own lives a persistent sin, some kind of corruption, then we ought to ask, is there any form of corruption that we're contributing to the body of God? And I think these like real consequences of what it means to live in a way where we find ourselves, again, outside of what it means to worship wholeheartedly, to worship with heart, soul, and mind, all of which we do imperfectly. Yet at the same time, are we being awake? Are we being made aware? I wonder if part of what's envisioned here and in view with Jesus' teaching is not just this idea, almost like I think sometimes we say stay awake or we say be watchful. And of course, like I love that Jesus mentions like the 4 watches. Like that's, I think, like a distinctly kind of Roman division of the night into 4 3-hour segments. And of course, it's going to suggest to Mark's Gentile audience that, and underscore this point, that it's not which watch, but that no watch may be presumed safe from the master's arrival. And so I think when we hear that stuff, we think, well, this means like, don't fall asleep. In other words, like there's going to be a test somewhere in your life or all of your life where you're going to be legitimately tempted to take a rest, and you can't take a rest. You got to keep like just going thrust or no, there's no other choice but to give it your all. I think what's better here, what's in view is in all areas of life, are you awake to the reality that God has given you work to do in the spheres of influence that you have, in the particular place in which you live, among the church people whom he has given you to worship with? Are you aware that at all times you ought to be moving and working for his glory, even while you are literally sleeping in rest, so that you might do those things for the next day? So I don't want to get too hyped up on it's kind of like, again, what's the spiritual equivalent of always drinking Celsius and Red Bull and just like toughing it out, like with your eyes wide open? It's way more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is going to seem like a weird transition, but it is, but also isn't. I saw an interesting video that I'm getting super nerdy here right now, but I saw an interesting video on YouTube the other day that was talking about how strange it was that there is like a night shift on the Starship Enterprise on Star Trek Next Generation. But actually, like it demonstrated something to me that like even on a, this is obviously a fictional television show, but like even on a spaceship where there is no sun, there is no actual reference for what a day is, right? We think of a day, and rightfully so, it's locked into a 24-hour cycle because of the way God has created the earth to spin and the sun and the sunrise, sunset, etc. But in this fictionalized universe, in this fictionalized world, there's no sunset. There's no chronology, yet they still divide on this. They still divide the day into these 3 watches. And it's funny because they talk about how like, well, there's the day shift, there's the sort of like second shift, and there's the night shift. And they actually even like turn the lights down on the ship to simulate a day-night cycle. And what it got me thinking about, and I think in the parable, obviously, like it's the 4 watches of the night. I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and like when you're going to do what's called a long rest, you have to determine who's going to set a watch. If you don't set a proper watch, then the dungeon master may make it so monsters show up and you don't get your long rest. This idea that even resting is an appropriate and necessary execution of the task to be watchful. I think that's important. If you are, if you think of like Lord of the Rings, right? And they set a watch. The responsibility of the people who aren't on watch is to make every use of that time to sleep, so that if something happens, they're alert. And then when it's time for them to take watch, they're able to be watchful. And the other thing I want to just comment real quickly on, because I didn't do a lot of prep for this episode. Big shocker. We don't prep a lot for these episodes. And this is another Mark and parable that I'm not super familiar with. But one of the things that, as we're talking through it, I'm becoming more convinced of is this really is about not just any one individual being alert, although there is implications for us. It's really about the whole church being alert.
That's right.
The church is the, I think it's in, I want to say it's in Timothy, I don't know where, but the church is the buttress and pillar of truth, right? So that's not to say we're the arbiter of truth, But I want to read this. I don't know any other podcast, although in our circles, there probably are other podcasts that you might hear someone reading out of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church Book of Church Order, Form of Government, chapter 3, verse passage 1 here. But this is, as I said, BCO chapter 3, Form of Government. And the chapter is titled The Nature and Exercise of Church Power. And when I was coming into the OPC, I don't think I was surprised in terms of like I thought the theology was different. I was pleasantly surprised to see that this was articulated and how clearly it was articulated. So I'm just going to read the whole section here. It says, the power which Christ has committed to his church is not vested in special officers alone, but in the whole body. All believers are endued with the Spirit and called of Christ to join in the worship, edification, and the witness of the church, which grows as the body of Christ, fitly framed and knit together through that which every joint supplies according to the working in due measure of each part. Sidebar commentary. The BCO doesn't have proof text, but if they did, they would just be citing to Ephesians 5 here. Back to what the text says. The power of believers in their general office includes the right to acknowledge and desire the exercise of the gifts and calling of the special officers. The regular exercise of oversight in a particular congregation is discharged by those who've been called to such work by the vote of the people. So just to summarize that, officers, at least in the OPC, ruling elders are nominated and voted into office and essentially given their powers, their official responsibilities, not by the presbytery and not by some hierarchy, but by the congregation. They call from within. But that means that the power of the ruling elders, the authority of the ruling elders, is not derived from some hierarchy. It's derived from the authority and the exercise of power of the whole church. And the other thing, I won't read this, but the other thing that I found really interesting that I really like is in Presbyterianism, and I believe Presbyterianism is what the Bible teaches positively as a command. I know there are other church polities, and I know everybody is trying to figure it out, and we don't all agree. I think Presbyterianism is the right way, but either way, Presbyterianism works on a sort of an idea of jurisdictions, right? And they're kind of concentric circles. They're not necessarily hierarchical, but it's narrow jurisdictions and then broader jurisdictions. And the most narrow jurisdiction is the session of a local church over that congregation. But what's really interesting is that the Book of Church Order calls out that when any valid jurisdiction of the church is exercising its authority, it's not just that jurisdiction that's acting. That's an act of the whole church, the entire Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So in a congregation where someone is in unrepentant sin and that session makes a decision, votes a decision to excommunicate that person, to remove them from the rolls, consider them to be an unbeliever. That's not just an act of that jurisdiction. As a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, when some church in Sacramento, California, I don't know if there's an OPC in Sacramento, I assume there probably is, but some church in Sacramento, California, the presbytery or the session excommunicates someone, I'm engaged in that act. That's an act of the whole church. And the only reason I go there and I kind of dive into that level of granularity is I actually think that this is kind of what this parable is teaching, is that as individuals, we need to be alert because the whole church acting is the whole church acting. So whether this takes the form of me just being really on like locked into my local church and making sure that I'm active in my local church, or whether, and I think there are some of us who are called to this, and I think our podcast in some levels sort of takes this shape a little bit, are watching what other people in the church are doing and sometimes are offering corrections, right? It is not the case that an average blogger has ecclesiastical authority in the strictest sense. But when I see, or anyone who is sort of involved in online commentary, podcast, blogging, or otherwise, I see someone in the church teaching something elsewhere, and I call that out. That's me sort of fulfilling this command of Mark 13. I'm being watchful because what that Christian says or does, if they're truly a Christian, actually does have something to do with what I believe. It actually does have something to do with me as a believer. That doesn't mean that you should get up in everybody else's business. That's not what I'm saying. Like sometimes
Right.
the thing that's going on in the church over there is just that thing that's going on over the church there. But for example, there was a pretty high profile ecclesiastical, I don't know if it was a trial, but like an ecclesiastical deposition, I guess, for a presbytery down in the Southwest, about some pretty gnarly things that were being said by an elder in the OPC church. And I wrote to that presbytery. They haven't sent it to me yet, but I wrote to that presbytery and said, hey, what you did at that meeting is an act of the whole church that I'm a part of. Can you send me the minutes? And I have a right to do that because I want to see what's going on. I want to understand what statements they're making on behalf of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church of America. Or I just combined like 1,000 different denominations
Yes,
into
you
one
did.
sentence. But I think the point is clear. Like the parable of the watchful doorkeeper or the porter is not about exclusively, I do think there's an element of it, but it's not about our individual piety. It's about the sort of readiness state of the entire church for Christ's return, if you really boil it all down.
Yeah, so I think before we leave verse 35, we are at least contractually obligated to say, though we've said it before, that there are two errors here that we should definitely seek to avoid. And because we're talking about, again, this idea that we do not know when the master of the house will come, that is the reason why we wait and we are watchful, like you just said. But it means that the first is any kind of like speculative date setting, which is a fool's errand. We've talked about that at length. The
Yeah.
second one, again, I think we're contractually obligated to say, is a practical indifference, maybe sometimes dressed as like pious agnosticism, like treating the uncertainty of that hour as grounds for some kind of spiritual carelessness rather than heightened attentiveness. So I think where all this wraps up, both what you said about one representing all, that is the church's responsibility. Yes, you're right. In Timothy, we get the command that this is the center and the pillar. So that obviously all this coheres with just straight up biblical doctrine of assurance and perseverance, because the elect are kept by God's power through faith. So what that means is watchfulness is not some kind of like anxious uncertainty about final salvation, but instead it is like this disciplined fidelity in the means God has appointed. And what are those means? Like, I feel like this is where everybody just shouts back, ordinary means. You know what I mean? When I say means, you say ordinary means, or I probably should say it the other way
Ordinary.
around. But this idea that like, what are those things God has put into our lives, has appointed for us to use, has commanded us to obtain for ourselves by his power. It's prayer, it's the word, it's the sacraments. It's a mutual watchfulness within that visible church, like you were just describing. And it's precisely because the timing of Christ's return has been sovereignly withheld from creaturely knowledge. So there's actually a lot in this, I think, assuages that really sensitive Christian conscience, which is like, well, you're telling me I have to do more. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying do the things which God has empowered you to do. And guess what? Those things are just very chill, very ordinary things that take on extraordinary influence and power in our lives by the work of the Holy Spirit. So again, it's like this whole thing of saying, like, when we work, we work. When we pray, God works. It's the same kind of thing here. There is work to be done. There is a watchfulness to undertake in all the activities of our lives, but it is not like whatever the equivalent like is of like spiritual, I don't know, like shots of espresso and Celsius to just try to, like, by all accounts, by your own power, somehow just not sleep. Not
Yeah.
sleeping is not what this text is about. It's actually about being aware, worshiping in awareness around all the things, and then devoting ourselves to all the stuff that we keep talking about, to praying, to studies in the scripture, to having family devotions in time of worship, to baptism, into the Lord's Supper. That's what watchfulness is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, this is again, I do think this parable has more to do with the idea of kind of getting after it. I think that's how we usually talk about, like, getting
Yeah, it
after
is.
holiness. I think this parable has more to do with that than some of the other parables with similar language that we've talked about. But I also think, as Reformed Christians, we get the cart before the horse if we think that even though that's what it's about, that somehow places the onus on us to do the good works, right?
Right.
The good works are prepared for us in advance that we might walk in them. And it's not even right to say like our responsibility is to walk in them. That's not even quite right theologically. Like, we are going to walk in them. Like, that's the thing, is the doorkeeper is given this charge. He's commanded to stay awake. And in good Augustinian fashion, it's really more along the lines of the doorkeeper is made to stay awake because he's been
Yes,
commanded to.
that's right.
And I think that's really key. And yes, there is something to say for fruit checking. And I know that there are probably some in our audience that just like threw up in their mouth a little bit when I said that. But the reality is a lack of fruit in our life. And by fruit, I'm talking about good works. Primarily, I'm talking about the ordinary means of grace, like you said. A person who is refusing to avail themselves of the ordinary means of grace, right?
Right on.
Regular church attendance, prayer,
Right.
the sacraments, Bible reading, sitting under the preaching of the word, fellowship with other believers. I would even say, to some extent, regular financial support of the church.
Mhm.
There are times where that may not be the most feasible thing, and so that's a decision between you and the Holy Spirit, and for you to discuss with your pastor. But the reality is, God has given us these ordinary means of grace as a gift and as a way to nourish and support us. When we refuse to take part in those, and I use the word refuse intentionally, when a person refuses to attend church, for the most part, most of us who have had a season where we don't attend church, and I had a long season when I was in college where I just didn't attend church. There was no good reason for it. I just didn't do it. And if I'm being really honest, it was because at that time in my life, I had some sinful patterns that I didn't want to face up to, right? That's usually what it boils down to.
Right.
But for those of us who refuse to take part and to avail ourselves of the ordinary means of grace, that should really cause us to question our salvation. Not because the ordinary means of grace cause our salvation, but because the ordinary means of grace are exactly as they're called. They're the ordinary means by which God delivers his grace to us. So if we're refusing to receive God's grace, it means we're refusing to receive God's grace. And the only people ultimately who are not forgiven are those who refuse to receive God's grace. So I think this passage has more to do with us in an sort of on the individual level, us being actively engaged and partaking in the administration of the covenant of grace, to use a more technical term, right? The administration of the covenant of the grace are the visible means of grace. If we refuse to be baptized, if we refuse to partake of the Lord's Supper, if we refuse to attend church and to sit under the preaching of the word and to pray, then we are turning down God's offer of grace.
That's
We're
right.
taking the gift that he desires to give us and we're saying no thank you. Well, when we phrase it that way, it's a flat rejection of God's grace that we're engaged in. But on a sort of like big picture scale, I think it has to do also along with these lines that I'm talking about of the church itself being ready. Well, how does the church prepare itself for Christ's return? Again, the ordinary means of grace, right? We prepare ourselves by teaching and ministering, right? I think it's Colossians 1:28. If I was on Reformed Forum, I'd have this memorized because it's their like theme verse, but like equipping every person for the ministry of Christ, equipping every person, making sure every person is mature and ready. Like all of those things come together as the primary mission of the church. And I know this is going to trigger some people, but like evangelism is not the primary mission of the church. The primary mission of the church is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, which takes place mostly on the Lord's day. I think all of that, the personal dimension, the corporate dimension, all of that coalesces in this command to be watchful, to stay awake, to be on guard, to be about the task, to be in charge of the command you've been given. All of those different concepts come together in what Christ is talking about here in verse 37 when he says, I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Like that's what we're talking about. So it's not as simple as personal piety. It's probably not as complicated as some sort of like, I don't know, least of these, feed the poor schema that happens sometimes. All of that happens. It really is just about the church being the church and doing the things the church does, both on the individual level, but also on the corporate level.
And that's why, as loved ones of God, then we can come to verse 36, which is the full warning, and we actually read it as a great comfort. So it says, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And after all we're talking about here, the way I read this warning against complacency is entirely consistent with, instead of being contradictory to, the doctrine of perseverance of the saints. Because perseverance is not fatalism. And I'm still learning this, loved ones. I can even hear what I marvel at is the warnings of scripture are themselves among the ordinary means by which God preserves his people. So I go back to the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 17, which notes that believers may, through the temptations of Satan and of the world, fall into grievous sins and so incur God's displeasure, even while never finally falling from grace. So that sobering possibility of quote unquote being found asleep, I think functions pastorally not to threaten the loss of the election of the elect, but to press home, I think, like the seriousness of watchfulness as the fruit and evidence of genuine faith, which is what you're talking about. That's kind of like the Reformed theological jam in a sense. And that's why where I think we'd anchor like James 2, Hebrews 3 and 4. There is like a call of the necessity of perseverance in the means as the mark of the true, as opposed to be merely, of course, like some kind of profession of discipleship. The visible church, we talked about this too, mixed as it is here warned that the formal membership in the household is no substitute for actual wakefulness. And so I hope we see that warning as not something that's like, well, you gotta check yourself every day. Because if you just step out of line once, if you fall asleep at any little thing, then it just goes to show you that you weren't serious enough. Instead, it's like you said, Tony, like even the warning itself is proof positive that God will save, that he arrests, that he holds everything firm and secure, and that even the setting of the table or the preparing of the good works, and then the way in which you walk in them, we might ask, how is it that you are even walking? And so even this is all an act of God, whether we speak about that justification, that initial positional sanctification, and even the progressive frame as well, is all happens here because God is in fact doing that good work. So it's a good warning because it reminds us that what's, I think, the particular and special dispensation of the Christian is that in this falling asleep, as the Westminster Confession says, it may mean that we fall even into grievous sins. We're incurring God's displeasure. We're not disrupting our identity in Christ, but we are disrupting our harmony with Christ. And so we always want to seek and to live in that kind of beautiful harmony where there is, I think, obedience for reward. There is a special fellowship that comes from being close to God in this way. We should always strive after that and want that very thing. But at no point does the Christian who even falls in the grievous sins, as the confession reminds us, fall outside of God's mercy and grace. Merely we fall outside of God's pleasure. And we will finally return to grace by his power in our lives, which he himself affects, so that even in our fall, even in our death every day, there is a little bit of resurrection that restores us.
Yeah. Yeah. Another way to put this, and I don't mean to trigger our dispensationalist friends and family who are listening to the show. I will speak from my own experience coming out of a dispensationalist framework when I was in high school and early college. There was a lot of focus on being, quote, rapture ready. And I think sometimes we can read parables like this to think that stay awake means be rapture ready. And what that means is, like, in some forms of dispensationalism, and I think probably many forms of dispensationalism, there's this idea that, like, if you're not right with God in this sense you're talking about, if like you're in disharmony with God when the rapture comes, you may ultimately be saved, but you're not going to be saved by the rapture, which means you're going to have to deal with the tribulation, and that's no good. So, like, if your piety is not on point when the rapture happens, all your friends are going to be taken away and you're going to be left behind, right? I don't think it's too much of a caricature to talk about Left Behind when there's an entire dispensational book series about this, right? The whole concept behind the Left Behind novel is that it's populated by people who thought they were Christians who weren't. And some of those are because they had a false profession of faith. Some of them were just what a lot of people would just call backslidden Baptists or backslidden Christians who had a genuine profession of faith, but just weren't living in a holy fashion. I think we can sometimes read this, whether we're dispensationalists or not, we can read these kinds of parables in light of rapture readiness. I think it's both more assuring and also infinitely more severe than that. It's not about rapture ready. It's about whether you're saved or not, whether you are in the kingdom of God, whether you are among the household of believers. All of the people in view in this parable are members of the master's household, right? They're all his servants. So it's not as though there are some who are outside of his family that are being given a command to be watchful. There's also no consequence implied for the doorkeeper if somehow he's not watchful. It's more along the lines of, if you're in the faith, if you are the doorkeeper or a doorkeeper in the king's house, then you ought to be watchful because that's what you do. And so there's no like implied consequence. There's no assumption that the doorkeeper somehow won't be watchful. So I think if there's any sort of like gut check, status check that needs to happen, it's really more along the lines of, are we in the Lord's household or
That's
are we
right.
not?
That's
And I
right.
think that's what you're getting at. If we're in the Lord's household, if we're members of his house, if we're servants in his kingdom, then we will be awake when the time comes. We will be awake when he returns. And the other thing, and I'll just throw this out there maybe as a tease. I don't think there's enough here for us to come back to it next week. Although I've been wrong before, and sometimes Jesse and I have conversations right after that turn into the next episode. I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you ran into this when you were reading it, but
Yeah.
verse 35, therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows. That's a
Right.
very interesting phrase to me, or
It
in the
is. Yeah.
morning. It's just another chapter or two when
Yep.
we see the disciples fall asleep in the Garden of
Right.
Gethsemane, right? Gethsemane. The disciples fall asleep. We see language of the watches, right? The hours that Christ is alive and dies on the cross are associated with the watches.
Right.
And then, of course, the rooster crowing. And it's a very well-known, I don't want to call it a fact because that might be too strong, but it's a pretty accepted theory in the sort of academic understanding of the authors of the Gospels, that Mark actually represents Peter's testimony. That the sort of apostolic imprimatur of the Gospel of Mark is actually that John Mark, probably while he was ministering with Peter, was being told this account, and he's collecting Peter's statements on the events of the gospel. It is very interesting to me that this phrase about the rooster crowing associated with being watchful and ready in the service of the master would
Yep.
appear particularly in the gospel that's associated with Peter. And
Right.
I'll throw that out there just as maybe food for discussion in our Telegram chat. But I do think even that is sort of for our benefit, right?
Right.
We're not talking about, this isn't a parable about what happens when you betray Jesus and hang yourself with a rope, right? This isn't Judas, who never was a believer. If we're drawing this parallel, this is a parable about Peter, or related to Peter's experience, who was restored, who ultimately had a moment of sleepiness, I guess, both physically and spiritually here, had a moment of sleepiness, but ultimately was awake when the master came.
That's
And I
right.
think like there's something there for us to tease out. And again, maybe we'll leave that for the Telegram chat. Maybe that's just for your own personal study. I've done zero commentary work, so maybe this is a connection that I feel is super novel, but actually everyone else makes. But I just thought it was really interesting how closely that language, that sequence of the watchfulness, the watch, sleepiness, awakefulness, and the rooster crows, how closely that lines up to the events that would be, if we were going through Mark sequentially, we
Yep.
would be encountering in just a couple chapters, right? In just chapter
They're coming
15,
up.
we're talking about this exact thing. So it's very interesting to me. The Holy Spirit is amazing in how he has put together this,
Yes.
even if that is a super tenuous connection, it's still a connection. And
It
I have a
is.
tough time thinking anyone who's familiar with the Passion accounts would read this and not go, ooh, that's a lot of language from the Passion account. It's a lot of
Yes.
language related to what happened in just a few chapters.
Yes, I'm with you. Like we said, there's so much that's within these couple of verses. And you'd have to think, if you are reading this with brand new eyes, with eyes that never seen this text before, and you were just going straight through, you'd come in just a few short chapters to that whole narrative in Gethsemane and be like, what didn't this guy Jesus just say to them,
Yes.
like, be watchful, stay awake? And here they are. Isn't that ironic? Here they are in the garden. And he said
Yeah.
to them again, stay awake. They fall asleep. He comes back. It's like, could you not watch for 1 hour? He's
Yeah.
using all the same language that he just talked before. So I think we shouldn't discount that and just throw that away. I think if I had to put all this together in like my own strange metaphor based on a lot of what we said, it would be something like this. Let's say that, let's not say I am. So let's just say I am. I am a husband. And so one way you could think about, well, what it means to be watchful as a husband could be that I put this pressure on myself to make sure that any point in time, if somebody asks if I'm married, or if I need to show that I'm married, or I need to prove that I'm married, I need to have my marriage certificate at the ready. And so, like, the way I do that, the way I can interpret that watchfulness is I keep it in the outside pocket. I always keep it with me. Has to be at arm's length. It has to be ready to whip it out and show it to somebody. So I can prove, yes, look, I am in fact married to Jen. Here it is on paper, and I am a husband. The other way you might think about this, which I think is the more proper way of what it means to be watchful, sober-minded, to be aware of what it means to be a husband, is in all of my duties of life, to always be remembering and to acknowledge and to represent and to honor my wife in how I talk and how I interact with others. Now, some of that might be in the very watchful way we say to avoid temptations because marriage necessarily commands it, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's thinking of my wife throughout the day. It's interacting with people
Yes.
in such a way that at any given point in time, it becomes obvious, though not obnoxious, that I am in this committed relationship of which I have great identity and harmony. And if I think we look at it that way, then the ordinary ways of showing that I'm a husband are the ordinary ways of doing life in relationship, even when that person is not with you. And so
Yes.
that's so much of what we have here that I still have responsibility as a husband that I ought to honor and obligate myself to and to my wife that are necessary to obey and to, fall into rhythm with, even when she is not present with me. And so that, of course, is where this whole thing breaks down to a great degree. However, I think the beauty of this whole thing here is that the warning is actually for us, loved ones. Like, I mean that literally, not just for us as in it's directed at you, but that it's for you because it empowers you to do the ordinary things which God has given to you so you can be freed up to understand that he makes no mistakes. Didn't mean to make us all missionaries somewhere in some far off place or even next door, but that he has given us everything that you have, every vocational skill, every talent, ability, and sphere of influence, so they might use it for his glory. And in that way, that is what it means to be vigilant and to stay awake.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right on. And I think a good place for us to wrap this up is I really like your analogy. And I think a person who is watchful about being a husband is not the person who carries their marriage license around in their pocket, right?
Right.
That would be weird to do, and I guess maybe that would be one way to be watchful, but it just wouldn't
Missing
really
the point.
it's missing the point, yeah. And like a better way would be like, you know, occasionally you'll see like funny videos online of like somebody who's at an event and it's a husband and like a pretty girl is flirting with them and they just kind of like point to their wedding ring and it's just
Right.
the end. It's just the end of the discussion, right? It's this idea that like no matter where I go, no matter what I do, no matter who I'm with or not with, I am always going to be a husband. That's a fundamental part of my identity, and that does and should shape every single thing and everything I do, whether it's conscious or not. And
Right.
I think as a husband, there are points in the day where I realize there are decisions that I'm making and thoughts that I'm having that are entirely related to the fact that I'm a husband or a father or, whatever fundamental identity element there is, right? Um, the fact that I'm a Christian is even more foundational identity marker of who I am. And so when I go into a patient encounter at the hospital, or when I pull up to a red light, or when I order a sandwich at McDonald's and they get it wrong, like all of these different scenarios, I bring with me the fact that I am a Christian, the fact that I am a servant of Christ, that I am a doorkeeper in the house of the living God, right? I need to be watchful, both in my personal piety in those moments, but also just in general. I need to be watchful. This is just um the doorkeeper is not let me put it this way. The doorkeeper doesn't do what he does to become the doorkeeper in this parable, right?
Right.
He's already the doorkeeper, and the fact that he's the doorkeeper explains why he's given certain responsibilities and certain commands. That's the way it is for us as Christians. We're expected to follow the moral law. We're expected to represent God's name, which is really just an extension of the third commandment. But we're expected to do those things, not because those things make us Christians or make us members of God's household, but because we already are. And I think ultimately that's kind of where this parable lands, is we're watchful because of who we are and what we are in God's kingdom, not because it gives us a status, but because of the status we already have.
Amen. That's right on. Well, there's all these ordinary means of grace, which we should encourage one another in, to participate in them, to love and cherish them, and to understand that those are, in fact, the good works that God has set apart for us to walk in. And then there's the ordinary things that you can do to support the podcast, which are of a much lesser nature, but they're still, believe it or not, just ordinary. So here's a couple of things you can do. One is, Tony already referenced it. It was the tease. And that is, we use this app called Telegram. You can download it. You can go to any browser and just type in t.me/Reformed Brotherhood. And that link will take you to a bunch of brothers and sisters who are hanging out, listening to the podcast and doing life together from all over the world. Just come hang out. It's a lot of fun. The second thing you can do is just head on over to reformedbrotherhood.com. And what you'll find there is 500 of the best episodes that have been ever recorded into the internet. Just
Most definitive episodes.
Yes, exactly. Just living there, they're waiting for you. And then what you're going to find as you listen to them is you'll notice that there's like strangely no interruption for a ZipRecruiter ad. There's no like purple mattress testimony in the middle of that. And you'll think to yourself, how is it possible that over 500 hours of this could be put on the internet without a paywall? No Jericho walls that I have to tumble down. How is that possible? Loved ones, it's because so many have decided that after their other responsibilities have been fulfilled financially, they want to give just a little bit to make sure that all the hosting, posting, and editing fees are covered so that this can just keep going out. If you'd like to bless somebody else in that way, and really that's not a gift to us so much as it is to, I think, others, there are Christians all over the globe that we know stumble upon the podcast for whatever reason. And because of how good God is, because of the very ordinary things that we're talking about here, just the simple act of praising God in voice and in conversation can somehow edify or encourage somebody, particularly in a very rough time or place. We've heard that testimony over and over again. And I think, Tony, we're always so humbled by that kind of thing. That happens because people give. So you can go to patreon.com/Reformed Brotherhood and just a little bit there, one time or a recurring gift of any amount, big or small. Make sure that this kind of thing just keeps going. It's a lot of fun. We love to do it, and we hope that we'll continue to be able to do it for as long as the Lord tarries or until he calls Tony and I into his glory.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I hope we are still doing this podcast when the Lord comes back or when we die, because I love doing it and I don't want to stop. And that was a weird transition, and I'm just going to slide it into gear. Anyway, yeah, I don't know what I just did. It's like I forgot how to podcast tonight, Jesse. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but Jesse, I appreciate this conversation. I've loved the work we're doing on the parables. I love all of the Bible. I think I've come to sort of love the Gospels more through these conversations. So I'm excited. You know, we're going to be coming up to the end of the parable series in somewhat short order, although short order on this podcast is usually a matter of months and sometimes years. But I'm excited to continue into the parables of Luke. Again, there are some that are unique to Luke that I think are really interesting and have a little bit of a different flavor.
For sure.
So please stick with us. Please come back next week. And you know, if this is something that's been edifying to you, beyond donating on Patreon or joining our Telegram chat, we would also really just love it if you would just share this episode with someone that you think it would benefit. We do this because we love the Lord Jesus and because we're passionate about his word and we're passionate about theology. And we don't spend a dime on advertising. So your Patreon dollars aren't going to that. But what we do want you to do is we want people to find the podcast because someone else thinks it's beneficial to them and it starts a conversation. So if this episode or any of the episodes has been productive and fruitful for you, we would love it if you would just take a minute, do it right through your phone, share it to somebody that you know that you think would benefit from it or who would enjoy it. And, you know, I think that's really all we have tonight, Jesse. So I think until next time, honor everyone.
Love the brotherhood.
What if I'm far from home? Oh, brother, I would hear you call. What if I lose
So
it
we're going to get there. But of course, before we do that, are you frozen?
No, I'm here. I was just very still.
I thought you were frozen. Let's do this. Let's just start over.